I just want to get the thumbs up. It's good to go.
Yes.
Great. Well, I'm delighted to welcome Dave Whitson to our meeting to deliver his keynote talk. I first met Dave on the Camino del Norte as he was shepherding a gaggle of high school kids across that beautiful route. He had them so well trained that I think he should give lessons to all new pilgrims on how to make a quick exit and a quiet one from albergues in the morning. Dave Whitson has been teaching high school in Portland, Oregon for years, and he's about to leave this dream job and set out on his next chapter, which of course will involve a lot of walking, but more on that in a sec. Dave did his first pilgrimage in 2002 on the Camino Frances and was so inspired that he returned in 2004 with a group of high school students, a practice that was to become almost an annual thing for the last 20 years. He has since led student pilgrimages, which have included the Camino del Norte, the Camino Primitivo, the Camino Frances, and the Via Podiensis, as well as the Via Francigena. He's also made long distance treks on his own in Norway, England, and Turkey. And I recently asked him, what's the update on the number of pilgrimage kilometers he's walked? He figures it's up around 30,000 kilometers, but who's really counting at this point? So, what's the next chapter look like for him? Well, this year in June, Dave will be continuing his walk, which was interrupted during the pandemic, across the United States on the American Discovery Trail. He'll be gone about 4 months, and you can follow this epic journey on his Instagram feed, which is at DaveXUSA. Dave is the author of 3 Camino guidebooks, which he regularly updates. In fact, he was back on the Primitivo recently updating listings, and knowing Dave, he was probably also scouting out some alternative routes. And if you haven't listened to his podcast called the Camino Podcast, you must. Each episode is a masterclass of well-prepared interviewing. And speaking of the Primitivo, he's currently doing a 4-part series on that route. So without further delay, Dave, welcome to the meeting. Why don't you flick on your video and your mic? And we're looking forward to hearing you talk about walking the Camino in Communitas. We're so happy to have you here with us.
Thank you, David. It's good to be here with all of you today. A couple of quick notes before I jump into it. The speech that follows was originally delivered for the American Pilgrims on the Camino annual gathering in March, which had the theme of Rhythms of the Way, Lightening Our Load. And as such, you'll catch some references to that theme in the speech and also to the specific context of the United States. When I previously conducted research for my book, Pilgrimage: A Medieval Cure for Modern Ills, it reinforced that these are trends unfolding across Western countries, though the US is often, though not always, leading the way in the wrong direction. So my belief is that the issues are applicable to Canada, but I certainly don't want to imply that the contexts in our countries are identical. Thank you to David, to the leadership team of this event, and the Canadian Company of Pilgrims for inviting me to share this with all of you. The darkness was closing in. I was on my 4th day of walking across the United States on the American Discovery Trail, a coast-to-coast trail across the country. I was in Lexington, Indiana. Don't worry about how it was my 4th day on a transcontinental walk, and I was in Indiana, which, if you know anything about US geography, is not, in fact, near the coast. There are reasons for this, but let's not get caught in the weeds. I was in Lexington, Indiana. And I was preparing for a pivotal moment in my walk. After spending the first 3 nights in paid accommodation, a hotel, a campground, and a lodge, I was finally going to free camp somewhere. Veterans on this route had made the process sound easy. You just find a likely house, knock on the door, smile and tell them your story, and sweetly ask if you can camp in the corner of their yard. Odds are, the veterans said, they'll not only give you a patch of lawn, but they might open their home, giving you a couch to sleep on, a hot meal, some convivial conversation. Sounded wonderful. So that was my expectation. I started looking for homes with multiple cars parked outside. I approached the first and knocked on the door. No answer. I walked on a bit, found another, knocked again. Crickets. Discouraged, I carried on down the road when luck struck. A car pulled in the driveway just ahead of me. I couldn't believe it. I came to the end of that driveway, maintaining a polite distance at the side of the road, and I tried to look as inoffensive and unthreatening as I can, and I do have some limitations in that area that I have to acknowledge, but nonetheless, I waited. And the person did not get out of their car, so I waited more. You know, sometimes you're listening to a song in the car and you can't get out till it's over, right? So I waited, but they remained in the car. But you know, sometimes you're on the phone and you want to finish the phone call before you get out of the car. So I waited longer. Well, they were still in the car. So I got the message. I set off down the road. Before I was even 50 meters further, bang, there was a gunshot, birds exploded in the trees all around me, and I turned around and I saw the person standing on the deck outside their front door. Now, given that I commonly saw signs warning, due to the rising cost of ammunition, there won't be a warning shot. I suppose I have to be appreciative of the courtesy. A short while later, a police officer drove up to me. So, yes, technically I was pulled over while walking. He asked for my ID. I explained that I was walking across the United States and looking for a place to sleep. And he told me that someone in the neighborhood had called the police out of fear that I was trying to prey on elderly residents. He acknowledged it's not against the law to knock on doors, so I wasn't in any trouble, but he suggested I look for churches and cemeteries to sleep in. And then he drove off. Later that night, just before darkness had settled in fully, my luck finally turned. A man was working on his truck in his driveway, a Vietnam veteran. He welcomed me into his yard with almost casual indifference, like he did this every day. He offered me some hot dogs and bottled water, and then I quickly settled into my bivvy for the night, relieved to have the process over with, for one night at least. And so my point is this: finding your rhythm is hard when you set out on a journey. And it's even harder to find your rhythm when you're alone. The original title that I suggested for this presentation many months ago was "The Rhythm is Not Yours," period. Tom Coleman, one of the leaders of American Pilgrims, suggested adding "alone" to the end and some stuff before about Communitas, and that was a prudent and fair and probably accurate choice. But now that the presentation actually exists to accompany that title, I find myself drawn back to that blunter, maybe more provocative, but also maybe more honest version. Let me explain. First, some acknowledgements. I'm not here to be dogmatic. I'm not here to throw stones. Here is my glass house. I make reservations often when I'm on pilgrimage. I wear headphones when walking, sometimes for many hours. I love being able to listen to audiobooks while I'm walking for hours. I occasionally stay in private rooms. These days, I usually carry a laptop. I mean, that's like minus 100 pilgrim points right there. Someday, I'm going to need to ship my bag to be able to keep walking. And when that time comes, I will ship my bag gladly if that's what I need to do to continue on pilgrimage. I'm going to talk today about the value of testing our limits and pushing out of our comfort zone on pilgrimage, but I'm not here to define what that means. I don't know where your limit is, nor what your comfort zone looks like. So I'm not interested in orthodoxy, but rather some broader principles. And as I proceed, I want to note that I'm thinking about this whole conversation through the lens of punk rock. That's not me in the photo, by the way. Here's the why I think about it. I grew up in punk rock, playing in bands, going to shows, being involved in activism, and all the other DIY activities that are central to that realm. And strange as it might sound, punk rock and the Camino pilgrimage community, they have some striking similarities. And I noticed those because those are the two big subcultures that I have been a part of at different points in my life. On one hand, you have a consistent onboarding of new, excited, nervous people who come in looking to learn the ground rules while also bringing their own expectations and assumptions, along with whatever the current baggage is from the dominant culture. On the other, you have a dwindling group of old-timers sometimes becoming fatigued by the newbies, sometimes bemoaning a sense of loss or a growing belief that traditions aren't being appropriately valued or protected. In punk, the biggest criticism was saved for those who seem to be adopting the aesthetics without the substance, coming in for the fashion, some fun shows, or just to be provocative, without actually becoming invested in politics, activism, or other important communal expectations. There was a sense that they were cheapening or co-opting what made punk special. And maybe you can see the parallel to the Camino. The Camino, like punk rock, is countercultural in many ways, and it's probably become all the more so over the past 2 decades. And that makes it intriguing to many outsiders, and that also makes it uncomfortable to many of the same people. Those of us in this Zoom session are not a representative sample. Whether new or old to the Camino, there's a level of investment necessary to bring us here on a Saturday on Zoom for a couple of hours. My inference is that many in this Zoom are not merely pilgrims, but also trailblazers, wayfinders, and shepherds. And that we're looking for ways to do all of those things better. And so that challenge is figuring out how to do all of that, how to spotlight and celebrate and preserve the things we value most about the Camino and pilgrimage without becoming gatekeepers. And that's my question for all of us in this session. So let's come back to this. The rhythm is not yours, period. And to be clear, it's not mine either. I'm nervous about the frequent emphasis in Camino discourse about this being your Camino, about you do you, about this possessive individual claim upon the Camino. I'm mindful of Dan Mullen's excellent and staggeringly prolific podcast. I don't know how he does it, My Camino. And I don't want to be misunderstood about this. I understand the language in that context very well, looking backward at a discrete experience that lives on in our memory and the story we construct about it. And I recognize too that there are good, important points lurking in that phrasing. It's important to walk the right distances and the right pace for you. That's totally fair. But that forward-looking focus on what your Camino will be, that emphasis in the present on my Camino as I move through the stages, I think that's concerning. We are living during a period of peak individualism in many ways. And I think it's feeding that mindset. I'll talk more about that later. But the Camino itself is a deeply communal experience. Part of its power lies in the shared human tradition and experience of pilgrimage, following in the footsteps of so many who preceded us, who walk along beside us, who will follow us in the years to come. In the process of becoming pilgrims, it behooves us to learn from the wisdom of those who have paved the way, who we join as peers, and to approach this with humility and curiosity. In other words, it is our Camino. And instead of starting it new, we are joining it midstream. At the same time, we North Americans need to think about ourselves as guests. I am doubly an outsider, neither Spanish nor Catholic. And so that is to say that I and we need to be cognizant of how it's also their Camino. The first reason I want to argue that it's better to think theirs and ours than mine and yours is that we are chronically wrong when it comes to thinking about what we actually want, what we believe will make us happier. We have the field of positive psychology to thank for clarifying this for us over the last few decades. Now, I recognize that this first example won't particularly well with the crowd that has logged into this Zoom session. Thinking at home, which of these comparably priced things do you think will make you happier? And my expectation is that everyone on this Zoom is pointing towards the left. But here's the thing. Most people believe that a material object will make them happier than an experience. There's a certain logic running through that. The television will last longer in certain regards than the trip. But you know better. Research confirms your expectations. We anticipate trips 2.5 times more than we anticipate objects, so it's better before. Post-consumption ratings are higher for trips as well. It's better after. Also important, experiences are less prone to social comparison and the accompanying disappointment that material possessions involve. Incidentally, there are other benefits as well. Your friends will find you twice as humorous if you invest in experiences instead of material possessions. And they will also see you as more psychologically well-adjusted and interesting. Probably because you are. So people in this zoom aside, we tend to engage as humans in this phenomenon known as miswanting, seeking things for ourselves with the belief that they will make us happy, only for them to accomplish nothing of the sort. The cause of this letdown in many cases is something called hedonic adaptation, wherein we get maybe a 2-week sugar rush of happiness before the thrill is gone. It's that toy you wanted for your birthday for years, got it, and then forgot about it after the bed just a short time later. I find myself wondering, though, if the Camino can creep, in some cases, towards being more of a product and less of an experience. A bucket list item that you buy as a package deal designed for efficiency, simplicity, and comfort. That's not to disparage people who make those choices, but to question if it comes at a cost beyond the price tag. All too often, what we believe aligns with what we want, what we believe will make us happiest, falls far short of that. Our happiness predictors malfunction at a worryingly high rate. And that makes life complicated. We understandably want to attend to the needs of the self, to my needs and to your needs. There's a reason the self-help industry has proliferated. And yet, the efficacy of those efforts is questionable. In his book, Lost Connections, a book that's made a huge impact on me, Johann Hari explores the alarmingly high rates of depression, anxiety, and loneliness today. As a high schooler, I live in that realm. As a high school teacher, a little old for a high schooler. This is a personal story for him. In the same way, it's a personal story for me, though. In Hari's case, he spent years and years on antidepressants and finally wanted to get to the root of the issues involved. So he met with dozens of experts in pursuit of answers. And this is what he discovered. I thought there was something wrong with the self, and the solution would come from repairing and aggrandizing the self, making it bigger. But it turns out the self isn't the solution. The only answer lies beyond it. The answer lies beyond the self. I want you to think of the most transformative, harmonious, magical moment you had on the Camino. Maybe it was leaving a stone at the Cruz de Ferro amidst so many other stones, or watching the sun set at Finisterre or Muxia with so many other pilgrims around you, or seeing the light shine through the stained glass in León as other pilgrims and tourists strolled by, or watching the Botafumeiro swing overhead while packed in tight by other pilgrims, or a communal dinner at Horizon or Grañón. Maybe it was getting lost in conversation for hours with a pilgrim you just met, or feeling your body respond with a strength you never knew you had as you climbed yet another hill, or having a host care for you in a moment of need. In any of those moments, in all of those moments, you probably felt many things. But I would offer that more than anything, you likely felt awe. Awe is an emerging field of research, and Dr. Keltner is one of the leading figures in that work globally. He defines awe as the feeling of being in the presence of something vast that transcends your current understanding of the world. But that vastness encompasses many different things. Keltner's identified 8 distinct kinds of awe. Nature, think about the Pyrenees, the Meseta, the view from Osabrero. Music, being surrounded by fans, singing and swaying together. Spiritual, religious experiences joined together in ritual and worship. Collectivist, weddings, funerals, even sporting events. visual design, remarkable works of human creativity. Moral beauty, the example I use with high schoolers is the cross-country or track race where you're neck and neck with the competitor wipes out, and instead of charging to victory, you walk back and you help carry them to the finish line. Witnessing moments of birth and peaceful passage into death, and epiphanies when we suddenly see things as they are. Looking back on those 8, I mean, how many of them do we potentially encounter on the Camino on a daily basis? Pilgrimage is an awe-rich environment, and that's all the more noteworthy given the benefits of awe, which we're only beginning to understand. Benefits like awe supports healing. It lowers stress and increases well-being, and it's especially powerful among vulnerable groups like people carrying trauma. Awe is an incredible healer. Have you ever felt busy? I know it's probably a silly question. To some degree, you probably have been busy or are busy. But it's also true that when we feel busy, it's often just that, a feeling, driven by all kinds of different contributing factors. Researchers call this the time crunch, and awe has the ability to help us escape the time crunch. That is, awe makes it easier for us to be present in the moment and not stressed about later. Awe is also shown to inspire social cohesion and pro-social values. It draws us together. It galvanizes us. It makes us feel more connected to each other. It even reduces materialism, opening the door for each of us to cultivate new perspectives on our purpose and meaning in life. Yang Bai calls awe the quintessential collective emotion and notes that it leads the individual to become part of something bigger than the self. It integrates the individual into the collective, very much like the Camino. Awe is a reminder that it is our Camino, and awe leads me to flow. The idea of flow states comes from research performed by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He defines them as the state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience itself is so enjoyable that people will do it, even at great cost. This is also known as being in the zone, and flow states occur under specific conditions. First, they occur with tasks we have a chance of completing, not a guarantee. If it's too easy, the mind can wander. If it's too hard, it dominates our focus. It has to be just hard enough. And ideally, it requires all of our relevant skills in that moment to succeed. To get in the flow, we have to be able to concentrate on what we're doing. And as we get into that flow state, we are able to act with deep and effortless involvement that removes thoughts of everyday life. To sustain that flow state, the task must have clear goals and provide immediate feedback. And in the process, it allows one to exercise control over their actions while time just slips by. I recognize that maybe the effortless involvement part doesn't remind you of parts of your pilgrimage. There's some very effortful involvement on those climbs to Orizon and Osobrero, among others. And Csikszentmihalyi acknowledges that flow states are not necessarily pleasant in the moment. But I suspect that most of that does feel like the Camino at various points in time. And what flow states offer is a seemingly paradoxical impact on the self. When you are in the zone, concern for the self disappears. We stop dwelling on all the many different things we dwell upon, that we perseverate over. We forget about what happened yesterday. We stop worrying about tomorrow. We just flow. And yet, what emerges from this is a stronger sense of self, bolstered by this experience. How many of you were amazed at yourself over the course of your Camino, at your body's resilience, at what you were capable of? The answer lies beyond the self. And eliminating challenge is not likely to get us there. Flow is about finding that line, just challenging enough to keep us fully engaged without overwhelming us. We need that challenge if we're to grow. And I recognize it can be hard to face that challenge head on. two of the most paralyzing words in the English language can come hurtling at us when we confront something new or intimidating or alien. What if? It doesn't take me long to think of all kinds of different fears that have assailed me over the years. I vividly remember being scared as a kid about getting my driver's license. Maybe some of you had similar feelings. I was so focused on the risk that it was challenging for me to consider the possibilities, the world that would open up for me after. And I remember when my last student group was approaching the end of our pilgrimage. We had followed the Via Podiensis from Le Puy to Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, and 2 days remained. We would cross the Pyrenees to Roncesvalles, and then for our last day, continue all the way to Pamplona, the 2 hardest days of the walk for us. The students were nervous. They spent days before we arrived wondering how they would manage. And I also vividly remember when I walked from Lamar, Colorado to the outskirts of Las Animas on a hot and dry September day on the American Discovery Trail. And though I say Colorado, let's be clear here, we're talking about eastern Colorado, which is really western Kansas. And the sun was baking down, a relentless wind was blowing squarely in my face throughout the day, and my last water point came up dry. I powered and marched and then stumbled and finally staggered almost 40 miles into Bent Fort Inn, desiccated and practically crashing onto the front desk. For all that, my only other food options were 2 miles away in central Las Animas. I nearly fainted in the hallway as I trudged to my room. We all have fears. I could go around the Zoom chat, get responses from all of you, and I suspect you would have equally vivid memories of the what-if scenarios that haunted you before you finally set forth on the Camino. These were mine. Of course, what we learn is that the cure for what if is little more than, well, then. And we also learn that the best stories begin with what if. Nobody wants to hear a story where everything goes perfectly smoothly. That's bragging. And nobody really wants to tell that story either. We want stories of overcoming adversity, of navigating challenges, of bracing setbacks and coming out on top. What if is where the good stuff happens. One of the biggest things we learn on the Camino is that we can surmount our fears instead of avoiding them. It is a genuinely safe place to fail, the Camino is. We need those. When I was nervous about driving, I stopped and I looked around. I had peers at school who, from my 15-year-old vantage point, were, shall we say, unimpressive. And it occurred to me that if they could manage an automobile, then I could probably do it too. Those who preceded me cleared the way for me, unintentionally or not. And on the Camino too, I found confidence in those who had braved the route before me, who had shown that it was possible, that it could be done, that even the hardest days could become badges of honor. That was a role I could play for my students as well, meeting their anxiety with confidence, with the voice of experience. Sometimes it has to be acknowledged, what if does lead to oh no. Even in my lowest moments, though, I've been amazed by how a way forward appears. That Vietnam veteran in Lexington, Indiana, let me pitch my tent. The innkeeper at the Bent Fort Inn, worrying about my well-being, checked on me 10 minutes after I collapsed into bed, and then roped her husband into driving me 2 miles to a Dairy Queen for dinner. When I've been in greatest need, on the Camino, when walking across the US, that need has been met with kindness. How can we ever build trust if we are never vulnerable, never in need? One of the things I wonder about, though, is whether new pilgrims today might be psyched out by the more abundant supports. When you come into this new and see lots of posts and advertisements for tours and booking services and baggage transport and the many other comforts and conveniences and amenities today, all of them valid. is there a risk that this feeds your doubts or limits your imagination of what's possible? Not knowing any different, if I came to the Camino today instead of 20 years ago, would I have gravitated toward the follow the Caminos and Max Adventures and Santiago ways of the world, simply because that seemed to be normal protocol, and because it felt a lot more comfortable and safe than finding my own way? Again, to reach that flow state, appropriate challenge is necessary. In education, we talk about the zone of proximal development, that learning happens when we're pushed beyond our immediate comfort zone. But when comfort is available and security is part of the package, it's really tempting to embrace that, to not even consider alternatives. It's tempting to assume that it's easier to be a new pilgrim today than it was 20 years ago. There are YouTube videos and Gronze and tons of accommodation options and great guidebooks and apps and routes to suit every desire and baggage transport and restaurants that appeal to foreign tastes and dietary habits. But I've started to wonder if maybe it's harder. In his book, The Paradox of Choice, Barry Schwartz highlights the beauty of constraint. As he writes, part of the downside of abundant choice is that each new option adds to the list of trade-offs, and trade-offs have psychological consequences. The necessity of making trade-offs alters how we feel about the decisions we face. More important, it affects the level of satisfaction we experience from the decisions we ultimately make. To put it another way, the more choices we have, the less satisfied we often are. To come at this from another angle, consider this line from Proust. At this moment in Swann's Way, he describes when the narrator's mother hopes to speak with Swann about his daughter, but is prevented from doing so by the presence of an intruder. And here's how he explains it. My mother had to abandon the request, but managed to extract from the restriction itself a further refinement of thought, as great poets do when the tyranny of rhyme forces them into the discovery of their finest lines. The tyranny of rhyme. Instead of destroying the opportunity, the limitation sparked a new measure of creativity. Choices can bring dissatisfaction. Constraint can inspire creativity and possibility. In how many ways does the constraint of the Camino liberate us? Wearing the same 2 or 3 shirts for a month, eating the same salad or tortilla for the 4th time in a week, the same café con leche every morning, 2 or 3 times. Why do I struggle to find something to eat for dinner in a giant supermarket at home, but I'm at ease in a small grocery in Spain? Again, we have this idea that options will bring happiness, that choice will satisfy, that customizability will optimize the experience. And yet, it can be hard to settle into a rhythm when we are dwelling on endless possibilities. And I wonder if sometimes new pilgrims today are overwhelmed by it all. I need to pause at this point and issue a warning. My friends, I am about to discuss the tourist and pilgrim labels. If you need to log out of the Zoom session right now, if you need to throw your laptop out the window, I understand. No subject generates more heat in pilgrim circles. We're at the point where the Camino Forum has banned this topic from discussion entirely. I avoid similar posts in Facebook groups. There's rarely a goal to pursue understanding. They mostly just spark flame wars. But I admit that I got sucked into a thread a few months back, as a lurker, not a poster, when I saw someone take issue with this old pilgrimage saying, tourists demand, pilgrims are grateful. How dare you be judgmental, the poster declared. What is the point of these labels? They only serve to divide. I understand the sensitivity, but I do take issue with the critique of language. These are different words. They have different meanings. Those meanings matter. Instead of an implied insult, Couldn't we encourage new pilgrims to see this distinction as a growth opportunity and approach it with openness and enthusiasm? Because here's the thing. When I decided to embark on the Camino the first time, I had one thought clear in my mind. I did not want to be a tourist. Look, we've all been tourists. Some of us may be tourists this weekend, wherever we are in the world. We all know what it can mean to be a tourist, seeking enjoyment, comfort, maybe even a little luxury. In that quest for self-indulgence, we can sometimes not be the best version of ourselves. There's a reason that the ugly American stereotype exists and why a lot of Americans are advised to put Canadian flags on their backpacks. So what does it mean to become a pilgrim? And why is that a transformation worth making? Again, I wanted to be a pilgrim. Instead of days filled with sightseeing, I wanted to be immersed in history and tradition. I wanted fulfilling and exhausting daily labor that was embedded in community and culture. I wanted to grow in some very concrete ways. I wasn't satisfied with who I was. I saw pilgrimage as possibility. That distinction between tourist and pilgrim mattered to me. It matters to me. Now, I've looked at a lot of different definitions of pilgrim over the years. One of the simplest and most useful, in my view, is just journey plus intention. We set out with a goal or a purpose or a notion, some objective that elevates it beyond just a walk. So pilgrimage at its core, I would argue, is about intention. The journey within that accompanies the journey without. I have a vivid memory from my first Camino. I arrived in Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port at night, under the cover of darkness, on the last train from Bayonne. I followed the handful of pilgrims to the pilgrim office, checked into the municipal refuge, was escorted into a dark room filled with sleeping pilgrims, and quickly dropped into my sleeping bag. When my eyes opened, it was time to walk. Before I knew it, I was ascending the Pyrenees. And that day kicked my butt. I wasn't physically prepared, but I was young, and that helped. I walked too quickly. I arrived in Roncesvalles ahead of most, and I just wanted to lie down. The albergue wouldn't open for a couple of hours, so I popped into La Posada and got a room. You could do that in those days. I slept through the day and the night and got started after most pilgrims had already left the following morning. I powered ahead, at one point passing a long chain of pilgrims on an uphill stretch. I was alone, and I was disoriented, but I was damn well going to get wherever I was going fast. And even with all that, by the time I arrived in La Rosoaña, the municipal albergue, the only game in town at that point, had already filled its 8 beds up. Indeed, I grabbed one of the last 2 empty canvas potato bags on the floor and counted myself lucky. Others were forced to taxi ahead to Pamplona. The bed race is nothing new. It was a terrible night. I couldn't get comfortable, twisting and turning on the hard floor. Some older French pilgrims in the albergue introduced me to the true meaning of snoring. I hated it. There's no rosy glow of nostalgia settling in over those moments. I was miserable. And so the next night, I retreated into the warm embrace of a private hotel room. And as I lounged in a moderately comfortable bed that afternoon, I was ashamed of myself. You see, I was on pilgrimage. I had set an intention. I was going on pilgrimage to live in community, to be more sociable, to push myself to connect with others in a way I never had. I knew this would be uncomfortable. I knew it would be downright unpleasant at times. But the person I wanted to be needed to be stretched, and this was the way I would do it. And yet, just a few days in, I was settling for safety and comfort as often as not. and I could see myself trending in the wrong direction. I had to be brutally honest with myself, and I had to recommit. And I did. You know, it's funny. If today it's your Camino is a commonplace mantra in pilgrim circles, if you go back a couple decades, you would have been more likely to hear vale la pena. It is worth the pain. And that notion for me aligns with the original meaning of the word sacrifice, which is to make sacred. In a way, the hardness is the point, not a gratuitous suffering like wearing shoes a size too small or walking for miles with a pebble under your heel, but the challenge you can manage, the hill you can climb, the version of you that you knew was waiting to make it out, the change that is made possible through intention and dedication. And to be clear, the challenge doesn't even have to be physical. For me on that first Camino, it was social. Interestingly, one of the most common pieces of advice offered to new pilgrims today is to avoid setting expectations. And to be clear, that is good advice. Here's Schwartz again. When asked about what they regret most in the last 6 months, people tend to identify actions that didn't meet expectations. And that rings true. The pilgrim who sets forth on the Camino expecting to have a Camino family form around them in Horizon, or to meet their soulmate along the way, or to have an epiphany on the Cruz de Ferro, is likely setting themselves up for disappointment. It did make me wonder, though, what is the difference between intention and expectation? On the surface, they feel similar. How can one be essential to pilgrimage and the other be a trap? And ultimately, the distinction, I think, lies in those two first letters. Intentions point inward. They speak to how we live in the world, the approach we take. Expectations point outward to how we hope the world will conform to us and our interests and our needs. What's most striking to me about that Schwartz quote is what follows. Okay, so when asked about what they regret most in the last 6 months, people tend to identify actions that didn't meet expectations. But when asked about what they regret most when they look back on their lives as a whole, people tend to identify failures to act. So certainly, we are disappointed when our expectations are unfulfilled. But the most lasting regrets come from our failed intentions, when we fail to manifest as the people we aspire to be. I set forth on the Camino thinking that I could independently march my way to personal change, carrying some mixture of misplaced confidence and overwhelming insecurity. Only after I settled in, committed to the albergues, started spending time on the trail with other pilgrims, only then did I finally begin to grow. Because the rhythm was not mine. I only found it in communion. I look back on what I was carrying in those days, and I wonder too about what all of us North Americans are carrying on the Camino. It's worth noting that most of the hospitaleros I've spoken with say that North Americans overwhelmingly tend to be good guests. We bring positive energy and generally convey gratitude and appreciation. Many of us are doing a lot of things well. But we also exist within a larger culture, and we internalize that. The acclaimed political scientist Robert Putnam has documented that changing cultural context in the United States, quite famously in Bowling Alone, and the more recent The Upswing. Most of the graphs that follow are from his book. And even if they focus on the United States as opposed to Canada, again, I expect you'll find similar trends in your country. We don't participate in community organizations anymore. General membership has plummeted, as has the attendance rate of those few who remain committed to clubs and organizations. All of you participating in this meeting today, you are outliers. The nuns, N-O-N-E-S, are the largest religious group in America today and the fastest growing religious group in Canada. Church and temple attendance has dropped precipitously. And as a consequence, we have stopped engaging in organizations that support a wide range of pro-social behaviors. We don't trust each other. Those people in Lexington, Indiana, unfortunately reveal that clearly. And it's not just the US, it's most of the world. And look, it's even worse in Canada somehow. We don't know our neighbors. We don't get married. Young people today have broken the habit, and the total number of married couples has gone off a cliff. Certainly, there are ways in which this is a good thing. Marriage has had its downsides over the years for a lot of people. But as one data point within this larger whole, it speaks to this larger trend towards dissolution, towards atomization. You can even see it in the publishing realm. A lexical analysis of the relative prevalence of the words I and we in American books over more than a century. You can see that I was dominant around 1900, and we, and gradually over the next 6 decades, we took over, only to relinquish preeminence back to I in the succeeding years. From mine to ours and back again. Another symbol of the rise of individualism. When I was in 10th grade, I starred as the judge in the play Inherit the Wind. This was the high water mark of my dramatic career. And there's a line in that play that has stuck with me ever since. God created a man in his image, and man, being a gentleman, returned the compliment. And I can't help but wonder if, after the Camino and all those associated with it welcomed us all to be pilgrims in its own image, regardless of our background and beliefs, if we have gradually started to return the compliment, reshaping it in a manner more familiar and comfortable and in line with our own beliefs. I recognize that baggage is among the laziest metaphors, but there is some truth to it. We North Americans don't just carry clothing and sleeping bags and toiletries. We carry those cultural beliefs and values. We carry that distinct brand of individualism, the lack of trust, the breakdown of community, the expectations of privacy and comfort. We carry the expectation of buying a product as opposed to joining in a collective experience. That doesn't make us bad people. That makes us normal. But can we learn to carry that baggage more lightly on our shoulders, to lighten our loads? Can we learn to leave it somewhere on the trail, like a stone at the Cristofero? When we change our context, new possibilities for growth emerge. Think back on the earliest meaning of a pilgrim, a stranger in a strange land. When we are immersed in different culture, we see ourselves differently, and we appreciate our home in new ways. This is important. Let's try not to make the Camino too familiar, because it's their Camino. And that's not just a matter of respect, it's also a way of preserving part of what makes it special for all of us. So many of these issues I have raised, tourists versus pilgrims, embracing challenges, the temptation of comfort, the limitations of it's your Camino, they can and do generate nuclear level heat in a Facebook group or a discussion forum. But they don't have to. That doesn't have to be an inevitability. And it brings me back to this question. How can we be trailblazers and wayfinders and shepherds without becoming gatekeepers? And maybe one answer is by becoming better storytellers and better salespeople. Instead of getting frustrated with another tour company question or criticizing someone for using baggage transport or tossing around Turigrino like a slur, we can come at this from the other direction. There are possibilities here, possibilities that don't exist at home, possibilities that don't exist in our often all too siloed, all too individualized lives. Let's sell people on a vision of how we can grow and change, transform by facing our fears, seeing the beauty in constraint, in overcoming challenges, in exploring a life that is different from what we know, in reducing our focus on our own individual wants, and yes, in lightening our loads, and instead seeing the richness of a life in communion with others, a life of simplicity, courage, and love. Because the rhythm is ours. We can find the rhythm when we immerse ourselves in awe, lose ourselves in a flow state, and activate the smaller self phenomenon. Because the rhythm is ours. As Larson and Kleiner have shown, hills seem less steep when we approach them with others instead of alone. Because the rhythm is ours. And as Wiltermuth and Heat have documented, when we sing together, we share more. And when we walk together, we trust and cooperate and self-sacrifice more. Because the rhythm is ours. And as Shane O'Mara explains, when we walk in unison, our heart rates become one, and our brains become attuned to our companions, and our very breathing synchronizes. And the rhythm in those moments, it quite literally becomes ours. I'll finish with this. It was 7 years ago now. I was with a different student group that had followed the Via Podiensis. But that year, we finished our walk in Roncesvalles. It was late July. My students and I had a meeting in the dining area shortly before bedtime. After that, I ran into one of the hospitaleros in the bathroom. He had seen us meeting and wanted to learn about our experience. I told him about my students, their impressions on walking from Le Puy as high schoolers, what they had overcome along the way, and how they were feeling as it came to an end. And he was full of praise for me, for the kids, for young people making the pilgrimage at this point in their lives. As he walked away, a thought crossed his mind. He asked me when we would be leaving in the morning. I told him our bus was coming to pick us up and drive us to Bayonne shortly after 6 a.m. He told me that he would be waiting for us. The next morning, we shuffled down the dark hallway on the ground floor shortly before they turned on the house lights. And sure enough, our hospitalero was there. We huddled around him, and I introduced him to the group. He looked at the students and commended them on what they had done, on their decision to devote such a large part of their summer to such a momentous pursuit. He said that through their journey, they had been in God's hands. They had immersed themselves in a world of beauty and connection. They had ignited a light within that would shine brightly for them as they moved forward through life. And he called on them to be a light unto others as they returned home, bringing back the lessons of the way. And he did so. He gave each one of us one small candle from the church. So ended our pilgrimage, and we walked out to the bus. Those of us who attend an event like this, we have a deep connection to the Camino and a level of investment that transcends our own individual experience. We carry a light within us, and that serves in part to illuminate our roads forward. We can choose, though, whether to use that light to blind others with its brilliance or to help them see why the roads we followed are worth following as well. Because the Camino is not mine nor yours. The Camino is ours, and it is theirs. And it is that connection and the respect and the community engendered therein that lights all of our ways forward. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Dave. I mean, I've heard a version of this, and it's just amazing. And I'm so glad you were able to join us and share with our broader membership today. I loved hearing your words again. And I'm so glad you could join us all the way from Portland, especially as you're wrapping up the school year. I think you said you were doing some marking. So you've got a lot of stuff that you're trying to wrap up. And oh, by the way, you're going to just walk across half the United States. So with all of that on your pile, thank you so much for joining us today. It was wonderful to see you and to hear your words. And before you and I turn off our videos and mute ourselves, I just wanted to say safe travels, amigo.
Always good to see you, David. Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, Lauren, so it's over to you to close out our meeting.
Right. Well, thank you, Dave and David, and thank you, Dave, for sharing your light with us today. That was inspiring. So it'll give us lots to think about over the next while. Members, note that we will be sharing the video version of the AGM on our website, so you can tell your friends to go and have a look. If you would highly recommend they listen to Dave's talk. And to all our membership across the country and beyond, thank you for attending this year's annual general meeting. To exit the webinar, just click on the leave button, which generally is at the bottom of your screen. And after you exit the webinar, you will be taken to a short survey, and that we hope you will participate in. Your answers will help us plan next year's AGM. So thank you again for coming, and buen camino, everyone. We'll look forward to seeing you at another event. Bye now.